This is the Catholic Dads Podcast. Welcome back and thanks for listening. This is Jeff.
And this is Chad.
All right, how you been, Chad?
I've been doing good.
Good.
Is there anything different about my house today, Jeff?
I believe there is. Yes, I believe there is. I see a small Christmas tree behind me, which I love. I disagree fervently with the meme that says every time someone says Merry Christmas before Thanksgiving, what was it? A tiny
Santa
elf
Claus
gets smashed by a hammer or something like that.
The one I saw was like Santa Claus executes an elf.
Exactly. I disagree with that, but Merry Christmas just in case. No, our tree's been up for the last 2 weeks, pretty much that week after Halloween.
Oh, wow.
Christmas starts at the Dodge household.
Nice. Well, tomorrow is Thanksgiving. Not sure when I'll get around to publishing this one, but happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving to everybody.
Coffee's ready. So happy Thanksgiving if it comes out before, and if not, I hope you had a good Thanksgiving.
Yep, much to be grateful for this year.
Yeah, here at the Williams temporary house, we had to get a tree because we're probably not going to be in our house for Christmas. And Kim was at the store, and she was like, well, why don't we get a small tree?
Yeah.
So it's taken everything. It's a pre-lit tree. It's taken everything to keep Quinn from decorating this tree.
Oh, yeah.
So we have some lights, and we have like a little star. And I'm like, well, let's wait till Thanksgiving. Because for us, traditionally, Thanksgiving, after everybody's eaten and done whatever, we put up the tree.
Oh, that's a good tradition.
Yeah, so that's what we normally do. And since for sure we're not going to, obviously, we're not going to be in the house by tomorrow, we had to do something. So that's
great.
Where that is.
We, growing up, we always put our tree up on my sister's birthday, which is December 9th.
Oh.
In the whole, like, the stretch of the Christmas holiday and everything.
Yeah.
Gosh, it just seems like December 9th would have been, 2 weeks before Christmas. I don't know how we did it. So.
Oh, I know.
But anyway, so happy early birthday, sister.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So what do you have in store for us today, Jeff?
So we'll drop into the topic. Segue.
Nice transition.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I was listening to a history lecture on tape. So one of the things that I like to do on the commute is just have a lot of different things to listen to. So other Catholic podcasts, fun podcasts to kind of zone out, history podcasts. And here in Houston, and I'm sure there are other places as well, you can actually get an app that allows you to check out audiobooks at the library, which actually is fantastic.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and they just updated the app too. For a while, it was annoying because you couldn't speed it up. And I probably speak too fast on the podcast. Like Audible allows you to speed it up right in the podcast. Allows you to speed it up.
1.25.
Yeah, like most people listen to ours at 2x just to get through it. And so now you can do that on the audiobooks too, which is great because you can just get through it a little bit faster. And a lot of times, I just find that the speaker of the audiobooks is trying to be very enunciation, and they kind of move slow sometimes. And so anyway, so this professor that gave this lecture I just listened to was actually so slow my kids didn't even realize it was on like the faster speed. Usually they get in there, oh, Dad, slow down. But anyway, the lecture was really well done. The Modern Scholars series is a sort of an audiobook / college-based lecture, and it's like 14 half-hour, 45-minute lectures, and they have a website, and you go take quizzes and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, this one was on from Christ to the church, basically. And so the very early history of the church from, basically, Christ's death and resurrection to about the 500s. Which is interesting because we look at that and we go, early church or whatever. Well, that's still, twice as old as the United States is a country. To put some of these history things in context, right? But it was really good. It was well done. The professor, and I should have written his name down. Maybe we'll have it in the show notes. Did a good job. He certainly wasn't. It wasn't from a Catholic perspective. It was from an academic perspective. But he was very level and fair, and there was, I didn't really detect any bias one way or the other. It was very good. But it was good. And of course, from a Catholic perspective, it's impossible not to listen to the early history of the church and just see the church in all of its glory from the very beginning, right?
Yeah.
From Peter and Paul and the apostles and apostolic tradition and the way that it grew, and it was, it's always fun to look at those years as a Catholic, I think, right? One of the things that came out, and the professor actually said it, which I've heard before, and it was fun for the professor to say, was that the Roman Empire was the first time in history that you actually had an interconnected network of roads, communication, and trade that was basically the known world. That was really the first time, and I've heard that said before that that was when Christ came into the world, was the first time in history when evangelism would have worked, right? Prior to that, you had the Egyptians and you had the Greeks and you had all of these small pockets of civilization, but the Pax Romana, when Christ enters the world, is when there's really an incredible amount of stability in the ancient world, and that really allowed Christianity to flourish. So there was some divine wisdom there.
Yeah, I've heard something to the effect of, if it wouldn't have been for Paul, Christianity wouldn't have spread. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, and the argument was something very similar to that. Yeah. It's like, well, Paul was a Roman citizen.
Yep.
So he was afforded all these,
that's exactly
not to say
right.
luxuries, because, I mean, he was obviously persecuted mm-hmm. once he became a Christian, and he underwent a lot of things and was martyred.
Yep.
But it was, if Paul wouldn't have been a Christian, then Christianity wouldn't have flourished. And I'm like, okay, does that show the wisdom of God?
Yep.
And because Christ appeared to Paul,
called him,
yep. just out of after Christ's death and resurrection, he appears to Paul.
Yep.
He appears to Saul, and converts him. So it's like, okay, what's your point?
Yep. The so that's an interesting segue into where the podcast is going. So we'll see how that goes. So the lecturer also made a really interesting point, kind of to your effect, which was talking about a really pivotal moment in Christian history, and how there's a few points in history where if something had gone the other way, history really could have been significantly different, right? Yeah. So to put it in context, we're talking about the 300s now. So skip forward a couple hundred years from Paul, right? And you've got this guy named Diocletian, right? Diocletian was a Roman emperor. The Pax Romana is basically over at this point. The empire has fallen apart. There's lots of civil wars. There's lots of social unrest and that sort of thing. And the Christians are growing in this time period. Obviously, by the 300s, the church is very well established. There are already, bishops in every major city. There's multiple priests. The hierarchy has been established. And there's, there's guys fighting against Arianism and Gnosticism and all of those things, right? So Christianity is very, very well secured by the 300s, but it's still not, the official faith of the church or of the empire. So Diocletian is this guy, and he's got all the right intentions, right? He wants to come in, he wants to reform the empire, he wants to, he's basically looking at social reforms, land reforms, Senate reforms, and because, you put yourself in his shoes, the Romans have never thought Christianity was a real religion, right? What they thought was it was a Jewish religion that the Jews rejected, therefore making it basically illegitimate, right, as a religion, right? And so Diocletian starts one of the major persecutions, and it goes on for years. And he goes not only after followers and believers, but Diocletian is one of the guys that goes into the churches and tries to collect gospels, tries to collect works, and he goes after the bishops, which is a different kind of persecution. In some of the historical evidence shows that it was actually doing pretty well, right? The church attendance was way down. Diocletian was saying that his argument was that the reason that Pax Romana had failed is because the old gods had rejected the empire, and so he was trying to get that back by persecuting the Christians and bringing back the worship of the old gods, the old Roman gods, right? Even to the extent of he goes out and decides to prove to the empire that the old gods are still with them by basically picking a fight with the Persians and then fighting a war under the banner of the old gods, and he gets wiped out, which is pretty bad for him, right? So Diocletian's also the guy that splits the empire into the east and the west. So that was one of the reforms that he does. Okay. So he sets up an emperor in the east using the argument that the empire has just gotten too big to manage, and he sets up what becomes Constantinople as the city for the eastern. So he's really that guy. So Diocletian's a big player, right? He steps down from the emperor. Once he sets up all these reforms, he sets up an emperor in the west, an emperor in the east, and he steps out. He basically becomes an emperor emeritus, if you want, right? Well, the Western emperor dies, right? And of course, this is the biggest problem in the Roman Empire, is that then as soon as that guy dies, then there's going to be 4 or 5 guys that all step up. Well, there's another guy who's Constantine's dad, who's out in England, right? They're in York. And so he becomes the Western emperor. I know this is a lot of history, and I'm going to do my best, right, to get it all right. He's the Western emperor. Eventually he dies, right? And he leaves then the empire to Constantine. So Constantine is the kind of the next in line. There's nothing about being the emperor in terms of genetics, but he's the next guy. He gets chosen by his legions, and that is how it worked, right? The guy with the most legions wins. Constantine has his legions, and they all vote for Constantine. But there's a guy named I'm not really sure how to say his name. Maxentus, I think is the way it is. But he's in Rome, and he's got a bunch of legions, and he's got the Praetorian Guard, and he's got Rome. So he calls himself emperor, right? So this kicks off a huge civil war for the West, right? And there's a guy in the East that's kind of watching all this. Constantine then, of course, everybody kind of knows the story, right? Constantine then marches on Rome. He's gathered his forces, and he decides to go. He's going to go oust this, Maxentius, I think is how you say his name, Maxentius. And he's going to go get him out of Rome. Well, Maxentius has way more legions than Constantine does, and Constantine's crazy outnumbered, right? Constantine doesn't know that. He thought that he had more support in Rome than he did. In fact, he thought by marching on Rome, the legions would basically flip over and oust Maxentius, and he was going to go right in the gates, right? Well, that doesn't really happen, right? So Maxentius, though, believes that he's got the gods on his side. So instead of staying in Rome, where he's been successful fighting off sieges, he decides to go march out to meet Constantine, right? Constantine, as the story goes, and depending on different translations and histories, although what's really cool is the histories that are written about Constantine were done in his day. So this isn't 100 years later telling the story. These are guys that were the chroniclers of Constantine telling the story in his conversion, right? So there's a couple different versions of it. One is that Constantine sees the cross on the sun. Another one is Constantine is visited by an angel, I think. But at the end of it, he ends up putting the Cairo, which is the P with the X symbol on his shields, and he fights under the banner of Christ, right? Terribly outnumbered, he wins, right? And by winning, what's called the Battle of the Milvian Bridge.
Yes.
Yep. He basically changes the course of human history, right? And certainly probably salvation history as well. So Constantine marches in, and the setup is great. It's a Hollywood movie in the making, right? So Maxentius thinks he's got one, the numbers, and two, faith on his side, and he's bringing back the old gods from Rome. So he goes in and tries to meet Constantine on the other side of the river at the Milvian Bridge that's on the other side. It's one of the bridges that you take to get into Rome.
Okay.
Well, so he starts marching across, and his troops get on the other side of the river, but as he sets up his guys, he doesn't give himself enough room behind him to maneuver. And so when Constantine's forces come in and attack, they can't maneuver, and they start to panic, and there's a route, and the only way to get back is across the bridge. And so there's this huge kind of, you can just imagine the panic and the fear and, everything going on.
It's like a bottleneck trying to get back over the bridge.
It's a crazy bottleneck getting back over the bridge. And so they start pushing and getting into the river, and guys start to drown. In fact, Maxentius actually drowns, by one story, actually drowns in the river. He's actually pushed into the river and drowns in the river as the army is getting pushed back in. So Constantine wins the battle, right? And that's the day of his conversion, per his history. And Constantine's a really interesting guy, and I can't get into too much of his history. But so Constantine hears the call of Christ, right? Again, God working divinely, right? Picks the right guy at the right time. And as Catholics, we certainly have a lot of interest in history in both Constantine and his his wife or his mom, I believe, is Helena.
Yes.
If I have that right.
Yes.
She went to the Holy Land. She was probably a Christian before this.
Yeah.
She goes back to the Holy Land and finds the true cross and develops the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, I believe, at the site of
I think so,
the crucifixion. And so that, it, of course, as it goes on, the big story here, right, is that Constantine ends all the persecutions of the Christians and makes Christianity the official, or it doesn't make it the official religion of Rome, but he basically legalizes it. He makes it acceptable to practice, and that's from that point on it flourishes. And because he was the emperor, of course, everybody wants to do what the emperor does, and because he's a Christian, that becomes a crazy point of conversion in the church, right? So all the cool history, right? And the lecturer said something that I think gets to the Catholic Dads podcast part of this, right? Which is, we want as Catholic dads to kind of keep an eye out for anything that can help us be a better Catholic dad, right? Oh, yeah. Whether it's a lecture, whether it's friendship, certainly, conversation, whatever. You just want to keep that awareness, right? So I'm listening to the lecture. In the lecture, the professor says, again, this is one of these points in history where maybe there's like, there's top 10 lists or whatever, right? This would make the top 10 list. If Constantine loses at the Milvian Bridge, all of the history of the church and Christianity probably changes significantly. And there's actually, you can go online and you put in alternate history Milvian Bridge, and there's websites and bulletin boards and all kinds of really good classical guys that really understand this stuff that go into it. So one of the things is Maxentius was seen as an usurper by the Eastern Empire. So after he wins, the Eastern Empire maybe comes in and tries to beat up the West. Certainly Maxentius was not a Christian, right, and he wasn't a lover of the church. So persecutions under Diocletian had stopped, but they may have continued. Or he just wouldn't have had the support of the church, right? The other thing that's quite interesting is Constantine did some reforms that allowed for the strengthening of the empire for a while, right? It was still on its last heels. But there's some stuff about the barbarians maybe being able to come in earlier, which interestingly, those were actually Christian barbarians, right? Which is an interesting part of the history, which we can talk about later. That's right. Yeah, all of the Germans that come in and basically defeat Rome were all Arians. Arius was a guy that was a heretic, right?
Okay.
And he believed that God and the divinity of Christ was separate, two separate things, right? So so they come in. So anyway, there's a lot of really crazy history about that. So the Catholic podcast, or Catholic's Dad's podcast of this, right, is the part that really keyed into me while I was listening to this was when in our dad's life had we heard the call, right? So Constantine heard the call and he changed the world, right? When have we heard the call, or if we haven't yet really heard something that would change our lives or change the lives of our family through Christ, let's remember to be like Constantine, and let's not have an alternative history. Right? The church doesn't the church doesn't flourish where Christianity doesn't grow in our families. Let's not have that be our history. Let's have the true history, which is we answer the call of Christ and we change the world, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a very interesting point. I feel that more times than not, we will talk about it in terms of like our history, and we'll talk about, well, what if this event would not have happened to us, to my family, and what would life be like? And kind of we've already talked about the whole everything happens for a reason, notion and all of that. And I think it plays into it. Like, number one, you're not going to change history. You can't change history. So it's kind of like it's interesting to look at that point for me, but I don't like to dwell on things like that because it's really it makes no sense. I feel that if Constantine would have lost, God would have, somehow he would have still worked it to where, things would have still ended up this way, because I really and truly feel that, God works everything towards his purpose. Yep. And so eventually it would have still, quote unquote worked out.
Oh yeah.
I don't know how, but it would have worked out, because God is a loving Father and he's not going to abandon us. He's not going to abandon his church. So I don't think that whoever came in would have squashed it.
Yep.
But back to your point, where was my turning point was at the birth of Evan. When Evan was born and you're holding this baby in your hands and you're like, you automatically, I automatically felt in my heart that, things had to change.
Yep.
I had to do something. There's something other than just me, which, I should have had that decision, whenever Kim and I got married. It's more than me now. It's Kim and myself, but I wasn't there yet.
Yep.
Regardless of my upbringing, and I had a great Catholic upbringing. A lot of seeds were sown. I will say that, but they lay dormant for a long time. And it wasn't until Evan was born that I felt what you're saying is like, when did you feel the call? That's when I felt the call. It was like, hey, do something. Yep.
And I think so. The point isn't that the church wouldn't have flourished or that God wouldn't have kept his hand in history, but it's the idea of you heard the call and you embraced it, just like Constantine did, right? And if he hadn't done that, then history could have been different. And if you hadn't done that, then your life would have been different, and probably not for the better, right?
Yeah.
We don't dwell on it, and we don't. Alternative history fiction is a lot of fun, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But in our personal lives, it's important to recognize that call, and then also I think maybe just reflect on how important and powerful that has been for you. in your life, and just give some thanks for that.
Oh, absolutely. But I think also that God is not going to be like God's not going to be like that ex, girlfriend or boyfriend that got spurned.
Right.
Whenever they called and you said no, and he said, "Well, I'm never gonna call you again."
Yep.
I mean, in the Old Testament, he calls Samuel. He keeps calling Samuel.
Yep.
Samuel, and he keeps getting up, and he's like, God's gonna keep calling you.
Yep.
God's chasing after all of us.
Mm-hmm.
He's gonna pursue us, and God pursues you even now. God is pursuing me, he's pursuing you, he's pursuing everybody. So just because you've answered his call doesn't mean that you're able to just sit back and just coast now.
Oh yeah.
He's going to call us to do different things, and that call is going to be with us until the day we die, and he's always going to be calling. So don't worry that if you I know I heard God's call and I turned him down. He's still calling you.
Yep, absolutely.
That's good.
Good. That's all I had.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
That was kind of cool. Like I got to admit, I was wondering, okay, where is this going?
Yep.
Well, awesome. Yeah. Answer the call, I think is the thought for the day. Well, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening, and tune in next time. What's our Gmail, Mr. Jeff?
CatholicDadsPodcast@gmail.com.
And we have a Facebook page, and like us there.